Thank you so much, everybody, for coming out on a very wet Friday evening. And rather than going for a beer, you've decided to come and listen to our debate. So what is the role of art and artists in considering climate change? So much appreciated, and I really hope you're going to enjoy this evening. So I'll just start off by just introducing you to a little bit more about myself and Visible Dust. I set up Invisible Dust in 2009, and we work between artists and scientists and creative technologists exploring our environment.
That sort of brings me to climate change, and it's described very nicely in terms of the elephant in the room. I mean, it is something, obviously, that is being massively discussed everywhere, but it's the sort of quality of the discussion, the quality of the communication, and is it something that is really creating a shift in our behaviour and our understanding? And it's been described as being, the problem why we can't see the elephant in the room is because we're inside it. And that's the problem with the issue of climate change. Perhaps contemporary art, I'd like to think, whenever I'm working with art, I like to think that contemporary art has collapsed. It's become a useless system because it's been misused by the people who are involved in it. But actually what it can do is work with the most sort of extreme forms of contradiction, reflexivity and ambiguity, and that perhaps is where we can reprogram ourselves. We can reprogram our minds in a way to stop this slippage, to stop this mental block, and perhaps deal properly with an absolutely behavioural overhaul for climate change. That there's something about contemporary art that is always identified as having no use value. That's what contemporary art is. That's what art is. It doesn't have a use value. But finally, it perhaps does. And it stops being art altogether. It just becomes this way in which it activates or redirects our brains to deal with this problem.
2 winters ago, we had the wettest ever winter on record. Adam showed a slide then of the floods in the Somerset levels. Thousands of newspaper articles published. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to the percentage of newspaper articles that were published about those floods in the first month that even mentioned climate change? 7% of all of those newspaper articles. We've just had the freakishly hottest November day that we've ever experienced in this country. One hot day on its own, one flood on its own doesn't comprise climate change, but it's part, obviously, of an underlying pattern. And there's another pattern that goes along with that, which is that people are simply not really talking about the links between these things that are consistent with the projections that climate scientists make and climate change. Artists as well, I think, can help to make the invisible and abstract visible. We don't see climate change in our cultural channels around us in the way that we see other issues popping up, say, in soap operas or whatever it might be. It starts to normalise things, and you engage with it almost without realising. You're not being faced by a campaign. You're just engaging with an issue that's being normalised around you. But at the moment, climate change doesn't really exist for the most part in those cultural channels, and I think I was glad you showed lots of images then, because I think a huge part of the problem is the iconography of climate change as well, and in order to tell new stories about climate change, we need new images of pretty much everyday people engaging with climate change impacts or potential solutions. What we probably don't need is images of faraway animals in places that no one's ever been to and isn't likely to go to. For sure, they invoke a sense of empathy among people who already care about endangered animals, but that isn't the vast majority of the population most of the time.
For me, it leaves us in a situation where we actually have to look at who artists are, because if artists are the people who are using this imagination and intervention and creating new possibilities and getting us to think about what the new possibilities are, then we definitely, for me, really, as Adam touched on, we need to go beyond the usual suspects and expand the notion of what who an artist is and who an artist can be, if we all need to be thinking about how we creatively change the world that we live in. That's what we did with HighWaterline project. An artist offered these flood maps and these physical materials for people to use, and enabled, through collaboration with myself and other community organisers, we created a framework in which people who were affected by issues of flooding or vulnerable to those issues created the physical artwork themselves in their neighbourhoods, and they invested it with their own meaning about what it meant to their church or their school or their street or anything that they was really important to them. So we did take a lot of inspiration from Climate Outreach and Information Network because we connected with people's values. So it is possible for artists and communities to come together to create work that's actually meaningful beyond an arts audience.
So my first thought in terms of what hasn't been mentioned yet is the profound influence of vested interests, profit and elite on the narratives that we are experiencing in society. Control of the message. And I think where the arts comes in, and what I'm quite excited about, is the ability of the arts in general to connect on a human level with us, to reflect our fears, to explore difficult questions, to bring humour into it. I'm passionate about the role of festivals and the challenge really in terms of how festivals can embrace and promote behavioural change. Using art is that it needs to be fun and it needs to be engaging, it needs to be simple and clear, and it needs to be positive. We can provide an experience where people have experienced something different to their everyday life, and if we can make that positive, then hopefully they can take that back into their communities.
The idea of a cooperative organisation whereby we collectively decide what we want to do, and we effectively build a parallel system that begins to colonise the hierarchy and show it that we're the producers of value. We ought to have some say in how that value is directed. So again, that hasn't gone down very well with the senior management. They don't particularly like the idea, but it doesn't matter because I'm an artist on a placement, and artists on placement are allowed to ask open questions. You don't have to have the answers, and that's a great relief. What it means is I have to go and have conversations with people and say, how do you feel about your job being changed in this way? Or how would you like to have some more say in your employment situation? You touch the button and people come forward and they start talking about all the things that they want to do, all the people they know and like, all of their ambitions for positive change. And guess what? Divestment, switching banks and pushing towards a cooperative social enterprise fits very well with that as a vision. So instead of pointless self-sacrifice, instead of doom and gloom, starting to involve myself in my organisation and say, let's do something about this, is for me been an absolute thrill.